thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to GMIT and TULCA, and very much to Sarah J. Brown for curating this brilliant TULCA exhibition. So yeah, I'm going to talk about a body of work, I guess, that's kind of come together in the last 4 years when I started to, which was really an inquiry into material. And I guess formally, the work is, I work mostly with found material. Often that's the material that's like abundant in our environment in the form of commodified material or commodities. Because my aesthetic is a kind of DIY aesthetic where I really kind of privilege a kind of handmade, hand making these objects, and a kind of a process of assembling and disassembling and hacking commodities. And my process with that often is relying on kind of embodied forms of knowledge and practice, and using kind of routines of or performances around this material to kind of realize them into artworks, and taking sorry, the position often of kind of a dissidence with these objects, and a kind of refusal in the sense that often the artworks are kind of vulnerable or about to fall apart or perishable. And increasingly, I've been exploring kind of what's come out of that as care, or a duty of care, as a kind of form of practice, as like a sculptural practice. And I'm also quite interested in the idea of a gift economy as well within that. And that's really in response to working mostly with commodities, and what I call poor material. And I guess when I say poor, I mean that they're abundant and they're cheap. They're already kind of highly constructed in terms of their value and their lifespan. And often I feel my intervention with that is to kind of take things apart in order to understand them. I came across this quote actually that I'm going to read briefly by Jean-Paul Sartre from Being and Nothingness. It says, "The human body symbolizes our defenselessness state as objects. Clothes as appendages are camouflages to claim the right of seeing without being seen, that is, to be pure subject." So I guess the kind of relationship between my subjectivity over the object is something that I kind of continue to impress in them. And I guess, you know, humans are assemblages in a sense, you know, we're kind of actors within this kind of capitalist system. So this is one of the first sculptures I made, which I managed to make. Actually found sculpture kind of a difficult medium. It's kind of this like weird language that you make, you know, that you make up. And I made this work in 2016. And the bottle is something that I keep returning to. And the idea of the handheld really is the kind of ultimate consumer object and consumer activity that kind of peters out into all these, in these other ways. And I call this, and I think of it as like an open source artwork, in the sense that anyone could do this. And it was kind of, I was interested in the bottle, but these kind of super mundane in the sense that they're kind of ubiquitous to the point that we don't really regard them anymore. And really, it's kind of just a minimalist gesture of that's plaster, that I cast the bottles in a way that just tries to re-highlight their form, but also, you know, their extraordinariness. You know, I know, you know, bottles are so familiar and abundant, but they are still kind of these sophisticated objects in terms of the industrial processes they've passed through, and also often I try and think about the kind of base materialism, like the origin, where these objects have come from, what they've been through, but also the point of extraction when they've been taken from somewhere. So I kind of keep returning to the bottle, and this is a work from just this year. Sometimes objects they seem like this physical representation, but like flawed representation of inner experience. And often I've tried to think about the bottle in relation to my own identity, or being Irish, or how did a bottle, do these objects, do we use them, but how much do they use us, and I tried to think through the bottle within my own family history, and how a bottle might even, affect the kind of trajectory of a, through generations in some sense. Okay, so this is a kind of hacked slide. The center, some of you might be familiar with this. This is the Maslow pyramid of the hierarchy of needs. It's a template that's used quite a lot right up to the present moment in psychology, and it's really kind of a pyramid. It was written by Abraham Maslow of I guess what the kind of motivation of humans in terms of what they need. And so at the bottom, the physical needs of shelter, food and water. And I guess when humans get to, I guess, the more privileged that, the more, sorry, I'm crunching my words now, that there's an ascension to the top of the pyramid. That bit at the top that looks like the ascension is the kind of point of self-actualization. So when a human has achieved all the lower parts. And I kind of refer to this a lot in terms of trying to understand commodities and capitalism in a sense, because it's kind of, I guess capitalism really hacks a lot of these sentiments and these human needs in order to sell us goods and to sell us lifestyles and these aspirations. And the top of the pyramid would be, these kind of aspirational lifestyles. And actually, I've realized recently that this pyramid was a ripoff that Maslow, when he was trying to develop his theory of human motivation, he spent some time in a First Nations reserve in North America, the Blackfoot Siksika people, and had appropriated this from them. And it's actually a version of their pyramid, which was actually a teepee, but I'll come back to it later. So thinking through commodities, often, I guess this year, when our supply chains shuddered under COVID-19, we were able, those kind of systems that are so well concealed in capitalism, we don't really have to think about where things come from, but are revealed. And I through my work, I do try and think about these things, and essentially, obviously, the human labor involved in these. I was noticing his T-shirt says "Day One Team," and how to kind of translate that within artwork, within my work, and how to maybe show that kind of subjectivity and the kind of human aspect of these objects. What does labor do to the body? What is the effect? What's the expenditure? Equally, how does, you might be familiar with this image from the BLM peaceful protests in America earlier this year, some Kluskis, but also how objects accumulate within to kind of societies that create wealth or poverty, how material can become divisive, how material actually accumulates into, you know, objects of defense or division. This is a I called it a club. It's Frankfurters and a PVC pipe. And also, I guess, really the addictions and that accumulate around objects, and how we're encouraged to self-soothe with by engaging with material objects. And these are some more illustrations. And then how also, yeah, the economies of wealth. This is actually the interior of the home of the previous couple who were like vehemently protecting the interior. And I guess, unfortunately, you realize that rarefied art objects become kind of bedfellows as well of these kind of extreme forms of wealth. In contrast to thinking about poverty or paucity, and also thinking maybe about poverty or paucity maybe not being poor, that maybe poor is impoverished by capitalism. And that gesture, you know, that paucity is maybe a form of humbleness or frugalness, you know, that has value. And then I guess the ecological impacts as well of this material as well. These are polymer eggs inside condoms, and called handhelds. I make a lot of works kind of under the title of handhelds. So how to introduce, like what does care look like in a practice in that regard? I've often, like an ongoing theme in this work has been to try and think about an ultimate auxiliary, like self-soothing object, which I've kind of tried to do in various guises. These are silicone casts of the previous thing. And often, you know, nature really has the kind of, is the best ready-made in terms of having these forms figured out really well. You know, often I think nature is really the best artist. And these are brown because lactating nipples are brown. So this was kind of this works are from 2016, and they were maybe the first sculptural works I made around commodities. This image is from Wexford Arts Centre, and I guess initially I just really, you know, relied on practices that are already there in art, like the multiple, the grid, you know, these kind of strategies from minimalism, and I just kind of reproduce them. And you realize a lot of these objects that are in the world with us are designed for the body and with the body in mind. This is, so they were kind of more literal. This is a sunbed that I appropriated and turned into a projection screen, and also as a kind of a support for sculptural works that were strapped to the interior. This was a basketball, an animated basketball that was kind of dancing, rotating on the front of it. And also sometimes I would work with kind of creating the environments. I mean, in addition to these objects, they kind of accumulate in a way that they create different environments. It's interesting how, you know, these thresholds of how we walk into one space, and it kind of we're kind of well conditioned how to behave in certain environments. This work was working, it was a winter installation, so I made these UV lights that were on timers that kind of emitted a low level of UV. So food is increasingly a material, or organic material is a material that I use more and more in my practice. And this work is called practice. And, you know, often I think the idea of practice, sometimes I've kind of taken that literally, in the sense that the sense of doing something every day is important. And in this work, it was kind of an experiment, and I'll often do that where I set up a kind of perimeters to create an artwork. And this was the idea of self-care as a form of practice. So the instructions were to eat a grapefruit every morning, and preserve the grapefruit bowl as a kind of mold. And then I would go for walks around the city and collect the kind of detritus and rubbish that I would find, or even, you know, just the kind of runoffs from my consumer activities and my activities during the day. And in the evening, cast it into the grapefruit. And so this kind of accumulated gradually into kind of a record of time, I guess. Two halves would kind of, so two halves is 2 days. They're kind of like, someone called them nature burgers. I think of them as rocks as well. And I continue to make them, sorry, I'll go back. I continue to make them actually whenever I eat a grapefruit. And then I often frequently return them back to the street, and I kind of gift economy back into the outside world again. And I'm quite interested in that as well, of how these artworks do perform outside the world, outside in the world, rather than the kind of privileged space of the white cube. So this is an exhibition I did in 2018. It's called My Fears of Tomorrow Melting Away. It was a 2-person show, which I made with another Canadian artist, Lou Shepherd. That's their work in the window. And this wasn't in a gallery environment, in the sense I was on a residency in Paris at the time, and we were given this space, which was like a defunct shop, to exhibit work. And I guess the context of that space really informed the kind of work that we showed there. You can, it was opposite the Seine, which was flooded that winter. And also it was in a very kind of expensive area of Paris, but this was an arcade of all these bijou shops. There was about like 20 or 30 people, regulars, that would bed down in this space every evening. And it felt very uncomfortable to kind of display art objects in that context. And so, yeah, this is the image of the river. This is close to the space, the SELF sculpture on the IMMA. And the floods are kind of measured by the height of how far it kind of breaches him. I think the highest it's been is when it's come to his shoulders. And so for this work, I ended up cooking in the space for a few days with this. This is a seaweed gelatine that is kind of, I embedded different organic and kind of synthetic material in it, and used what was the shop counter to display it. And so that work was kind of leaking, and if it had left there, it would have, if for its full duration, it would have kind of hardened into a crust. But it was kind of light in terms of its, I guess, its use of material. And we wrote a text as well for that piece. And at the end of this, one outcome of the river flooding was that all the rats of Paris had like moved above ground onto the streets of Paris. So I actually fed this work back to the rats. There was a large kind of rat hole opposite the gallery. So I guess in my mind, there was this kind of good succinct circle between with the work. Okay, so I'm going to show a video clip. This is, it's actually a small scene from this film called Tin Men with Danny DeVito. It's not a good film. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but I kind of watched it by chance. And there was this moment in the film, the story of the film very briefly is these door-to-door salesmen that go around selling aluminium cladding to these unsuspecting housewives who are imprisoned in their homes in the 1960s. And there is a moment where Danny DeVito's character is at a buffet, and he has this moment of enlightenment at the buffet bar. But as the kind of con artist or the grifter, which is kind of an interesting kind of position, I guess, to take when you're, you know, as another way of kind of as an intervention on these commodities. But in this case, once he makes this kind of realization, he immediately seeks to kind of capitalize it in some way. Okay, so.
God, if you're responsible for all this stuff down here, maybe you got a moment's attention for me. Between the IRS and this Home Improvement Commission and Mr. Meringue, I'm just up to here with all this bullshit. To be frank with you, I'm in the toilet. Listen, I'm praying here. Would you go around?
I want to get some of the salad.
It's out of water. Go around. Like, just do what you can, all right? I'd appreciate it. Amen.
Okay, so this is just a text from one of the scenes. So this idea of abundance is something that I've been working more within my practice. And the abundance less, I mean, we have an abundance of commodities through capitalism, but I guess the abundance of nature really in terms of its generosity, of like continually providing this material in these forms. And essentially, the more I've been working with this material, I keep coming back to the point that really all material, everything really, its source is nature at some point. So more so, I find that I've just kind of brought that material more and more into the gallery space. And like through this kind of inquiry, I've kind of put more and more in a kind of what would be like an eco-feminist position, in that understanding really that which is really just recognizes the kind of correlation between the dominion of nature that happened in the 16th century, around about that time, and probably previously, kind of also correlates with the kind of suppression of female voices as well at that time. And really, and I guess another thing that's become apparent this year is how, you know, nature, I guess, rather than, you know, the capitalism operates in this idea of a kind of control over nature and exploiting it or as a resource. But I guess we've learned this year that nature is really kind of more in charge of us. It's more the boss of us than we are of it. And you know, I mentioned that, but I do think the gallery is a really kind of privileged space to kind of, you know, I'm grateful for that, to kind of bring these materials back in a way that people, you know, or I can see them again and look at them again, you know, for how remarkable they are. So these are petrified potatoes. So they're hardened, dried until they're hardened. And these are works that I made this year in an exhibition called SELF SOOTHERS that was at Visual Contemporary in Carlow. I guess, and they are called abundance blankets. And, you know, almost thinking about creating, they're kind of like offerings, I guess, in a sense. And I've started working with textiles more so in the work. And I'd say about these, in that working with assemblage, I often don't know how they are going to come together. There's a kind of flow with assemblage in that, and then the point of exhibition is just maybe like a, you know, a kind of pause in that. So these kind of come together in the exhibition, and then they mightn't, you know, I mightn't be able to remake them again in the same way. But you know, I've kind of learned to kind of trust that process in a sense. So yeah, I've been working more with textiles as a fan material that is abundant again. And as part of that, I, at the same time, about a year ago, decided to kind of spend a lot of time in these kind of commercial spaces to kind of get a good understanding and insight to the kind of the mechanism and the animation of these objects and this material. And I focused on Irish companies, namely Primark or Pennies, as kind of mass producers of fast fashion. And I would spend a lot of time in these spaces. I didn't particularly like them, but just to really understand the kind of flow of goods, the kind of turnover. And then I would kind of rescue these items at the point of when they would be like slashed down to their very base minimum price, which never really relates to the actual cost that they're making. Someone called it like a process of embodied carbon, which is kind of a useful way of thinking about it. It's like staying in those spaces. And there was kind of quite a few things that I realized through doing that. One was, I mean, the reason why, like briefly, why we have fast fashion in our world, why there is an abundance of cheap clothing, is partly when, like, this is down to the production of cotton, which is subsidized, particularly by American cotton farmers, which relates back to subsidies to the slave trade. So there's always these kind of historical long timelines, you know, and long supply chains to this material. And also this like kind of cognitive dissonance that occurs, you know, these blind spots in capitalism where material is fundamentally extracted and then distorted and reassembled. And to me, I guess at some point, if it comes from a plant and often an animal, there's this kind of sentience really at the core of this of this material, and this kind of structural violence that is often just, you know, skin deep in these objects. So the recent works have been trying to kind of bring back that liveness to this material. This piece again is from Visual, the SELF SOOTHERS exhibition, and actually now the handhelds have kind of enlarged into torsos or backpacks or something that you can actually hold or embrace. And this coat, this was a reassembled shearling coat. So often, like, you know, my intervention would be quite simple. I just tried to reassemble the shearling coat back into a sheep or a hue. Just another example. So around about this time, I started focusing on snake print. I think at the time, it was the last summer, there was like a lot of snake print. It's in fashion. I guess it kind of rotates in terms of coming in and out of fashion. And snake print's funny because, like, actually, I was thinking, you think of a skirt or a jacket immediately. You don't actually think of the snake. And my gesture simply at that time was just to reassemble them back into snake form, to return them back to snake form. And so I would like actively try and collect as much snake print as I could and return them. Around about that time, to kind of look further, I went to the UCD Folk Archives, which is like this amazing archive that we have here. It's the largest oral archive in Europe, to look for the snake, because I guess actually what I realized is the snake is a really prevalent avatar in the Irish psyche, from like St. Patrick driving the snake out to like all our Virgin Mary grottos kind of crushing a snake underfoot. And I went to the archives to try and find the snake, basically, and try and understand that relationship. And also to kind of gain a kind of broader, more the kind of indigenous understanding of material and uses of material. There's Mary with another snake. So this is an installation image of the snakes reassembled. Okay, so I'm coming back to the Maslow thing. So this is the original model that was kind of taken by Abraham Maslow. And actually in this model, the self-actualization occurs at the bottom. It's the base of the TP, not the pyramid. And then that kind of spreads out into a community actualization, onto a culture perpetuity. And what that means within the kind of indigenous perspective is really that, it says it there, that it kind of, that your agency as a human and your contribution within a society, how that kind of continues on into future generations. And within an indigenous perspective, that would be the kind of preservation of knowledge and of song and the kind of kinship and spirituality that kind of exists with land and the environment. So I'm coming to the end actually now on my computer. So just to end, this is a quote from the archives, and I have been spending more time in that archive to kind of like resurrect in my own brain like a kind of a regard for material that did exist. And it's kind of been remarkable to realize that actually this archive, it's not dead, it's kind of live, and there is a lot of information there, and there's a toolkit there of how to develop another relationship with our environment, how to have a kinship with our environment, and I kind of feel encouraged by the fact, I guess, the moment that we're in now, and this kind of ecological crisis moment, I feel encouraged by how it's not that remote, particularly I guess in Ireland. It's, you know, even in that knowledge is not that remote. It's even, you know, our grandparents had that, of a way of interacting with material that kind of readjusts the kind of how we're embedded within the environment, and how and the sentience of material.
Thank you, Sibyl, for that. That was very interesting insight to your work. There was a few things, Sibyl, that struck me. I was really impressed by your ability to relook and rethink and recast everyday objects with new nuance, layers of new meanings, and kind of question our relationship with materiality in art. This notion of materiality seems very prominent in what you do.
Yeah. What's the question?
the question is like, it's become kind of central to what you're doing. I notice how you move from found objects to cloth a lot, and your recent work is kind of engaged with kind of cloth and that production of cloth and how we value cloth.
Yeah, I don't think that was my intention originally, but you know, I started working with commodities as like a ready-made initially. And I was trying to not, initially I was like, didn't work with like what would be called art, you know, typically art historical materials, because I felt that they were loaded with history, you know, and that's a kind of speculative history at this point, but like I kind of felt burdened by that. And so I decided to work with material that was already in my environment and also like cheaply available. And I also had, and I think a lot of artists have that there's an ethical issue with like producing more objects when there's already a world of objects. And then realizing once I worked with them that there was a whole job of work done within these objects in terms of, you know, the kind of the design and the form, how that kind of creates particular, encourages particular behaviors from us. The realization that a lot of them is around this idea of self-soothing, using commodities as a thing for self-soothing, the kind of addictions that occur within that, and that all just became this kind of big, kind of tangled mess of like really where we're at in terms of late capitalism. So I guess I felt a responsibility once I started working with this material to try and understand it and where it came from, and I hope that arc came across in the talk, and was that it brought me back to the fact that, you know, that it is at some point, you know, that nature is the kind of core of all these aspects, and these objects, these commodities, do a really good job at kind of disguising that. Yeah,
because we were working in an undergraduate module called Cloth and Human Experience, and one of the students was looking at that sustainability of textile production, and we were doing great until he came across the statistics that what if we look at fashion, kind of how that damage to the environment, so that equals kind of washing a garment 20 times, so it's equally environmental impact. So that was one that really kind of threw us completely with this notion that we should reuse all the time and rebuy and stuff like that. But then the actual act of care of these garments is equally environmentally damaging, like, you know. So that's kind of, that was a good one to come across, but like, because we had to rethink completely about this whole notion, like, you know.
Yeah, it's kind of a minefield, because I realized when I was working with materials from pennies, when I was cutting them up, and like that would be my thing. I would take them apart. That's the first thing, and like, you know, taking apart the stitches was the way of me trying to like get close to the person that might have made them at some point. But when I was cutting them up, if they were fleece, I was releasing all these microplastics, nanoplastics into the environment. And I guess now, like using vegetable and things like that, I am trying to kind of reevaluate my practice to not include extractive petroleum-based materials. you know, because how can I talk about these things if I'm also, you know, and I like really like art, like every other industry is wasteful in a sense, and the manufacture of works can be really wasteful. And then I guess at the time as well, in a really practical way, sometimes when you don't have money to buy material, or having a sculptural practice in Ireland is, you know, there's a limitation of the kind of vocabulary of material that you can access, or the processes that you can get access to. So I really just tried to kind of locate it very much within that and not feel confined by it. You know, if I can go to the grocery store to get material, and also it's in those spaces, you know, not necessarily my studio, it's when I spend time in these spaces that I start to understand the kind of all the mechanisms and the things that are going on, and to try and kind of get the macro view on things. And like sometimes these gestures, like I guess my care towards this material, this cheap material, would seem futile, but it's, you know, less about the artworks and more about the kind of the energy that I imbue on them, that feels more important.
I have a question. Do you know if you can see me? Everybody's cameras are off.
See you.
Hey, I actually wanted to know the amount that the time that you spend on your work and the topics that you immerse yourself in your work. Is it very difficult to just not be working, because the kind of things that you focus on are constant?
So like, yeah, I don't know how to answer that. I guess the daily practice is an important part of producing work. I think you could ask any artist that at the moment, because it's pretty hard, or any human, it's pretty hard to switch off. So in that sense, sometimes making work is a kind of sanctuary for that, outside of that. And it's a way to reflect on it in a kind of deeper way. And it's and to figure out your position in relation to all of this material or all of these issues.
I had a question for Sibyl, and I was kind of intrigued about the way you went into Primark and the various kind of fashion houses, and you were looking at the various tricks that they were using to sell their wares, as it were. And it seems to be at the heart of your practice is the idea of unlearning. And I was just wondering, was there something you learned from the Primark stores that you consciously went away from in your own practice?
You went away from or took away?
I suppose I'm trying to think that the one thing I'm seeing at the heart of your practice is this idea of reversal. So, for example, you said, look, I look at a bottle, and rather than thinking of your own family history and how you used the bottle, you looked at the bottle and how it shaped your world.
Yeah.
So that was an example of a reversal. So I'm thinking, I saw the photograph you had of the supermarket, or of Primark, and it reminds me that, you know, they're very skilled in seducing you into buying stuff. They've all the tricks of the trade. And you must, in your time that you spent there, that you must have seen it all. You know, you've seen what they're doing, what they're up to. And you obviously you cannot reproduce that in your own practice ethically. So I'm just wondering what you took away from it. What?
No, and actually it's funny because I find more and more that you go into these stores and they are really good art. It's almost like artistic, the way that the presentation of these objects. I think at one point there's quite a lot of recent literature around the idea of cute as an aesthetic, and that was something like that was really prevalent. That is prevalent, of this kind of hyper neon, glittery, you know, unicorn aesthetic that seems to be really seductive, and you know, it's really in our animation graphics and online and offline. And there is theory, and it's been written about the cute, and it's kind of actually kind of reveals this kind of sinister under structure around the kind of master slave. In order to kind of regard something as cute, it kind of is actually because you kind of don't feel threatened by it, but you actually feel a kind of you can dominate it. But I guess the cute for me, or this neon, like I remember at one point I was trying to find some neon dyes, and actually you can't buy neon dyes in Europe because they're so highly toxic, but there's so much neon material in these spaces. So they, you know, they're being Bangladesh and India mostly where this material comes from. And so this like toxicity in it, like what I would say aesthetically in this kind of very hyper realistic neon toxic aesthetic kind of flows all the way down in terms of a toxicity in our environment, in our rivers, you know, the runoff from these dyes, and that toxicity also plays out in language and you know, in loads of different ways. And that seems to be a kind of theme that keeps emerging from these objects or from this material.
That's lovely, thanks.
Do you hang on to work that you have made from materials that you've gathered and recycled, or do you try to continue the process of reusing once the work has been fulfilled? Yes, I guess it's kind of an issue that my works don't really, they come apart at the end of an exhibition, and a lot of the material goes back into the current of material and gets reassembled into new works. And it's just like this flow of stuff, and some stuff rots and some stuff falls apart. And often works come, I'm sure everyone has this experience of works come together in the studio and then the next day they're gone again. You know, there's like, started thinking about artworks as maybe, you know, a 2-hour artwork or a 2-day artwork. You know, it doesn't always need an audience. And I guess, and then a position I take is making works that are fundamentally vulnerable or flawed, in that sense that they aren't perfect. You know, taking apart materials and putting them in the wrong place, the contingency of things next to each other, and upsetting that kind of clean lines of what a kind of consumer capitalism would want us to regard it. I think documentation ends up becoming very important. You know, I had a conversation with someone working in conservation recently in IMMA, a brilliant guy, and that was a really interesting conversation. And I think it's probably conversations between artists and conservationists should happen more frequently. And he was talking about, I guess, particularly with contemporary sculpture, there's this whole new array of materials that are inherently what they'd call unstable, and the kind of problems of preserving them. He was talking about Eva Hess's silicone latex works in MoMA that they've almost disintegrated into like gloopy like blobs, you know, and so there's this enormous value attached to, you know, and at some point the work perishes. So, like, you know, art, like I kind of believe that in the sense that artists have done a lot of the work, and artists have done work, and we can use some of those strategies. They're there for us to use. So, you know, I like in relation to performance, photography is really important, and video to kind of as a way of preserving it, or a set of instructions so that, you know, and 50 years time that work can be reproduced. But like for my works, I understood from that conversation that some of what was interesting, for example, is the bottles, that plastic will start to disintegrate. We know it lasts 1,000 years or, more so. Plastic has a very long lifeline, but the quality, the colors and the dyes in the liquid will start to fade. And he told me of this process, which is the same process people with bombs would use on airplanes. This was why we were banned using liquids, is of how you can make these small incisions in the bottle and extract the liquid and put in a new liquid. And that would be one way of preserving it. But ideally, you don't kind of, you don't stop yourself. Like, I think if you're thinking about the value of the artwork when you're making it, you're really that's not really, for me anyway, the right way of approaching an artwork. I would do the reverse and think about it afterwards. But, essentially in terms of like a gift economy, or we're just returning things back to their environment, or that they can disintegrate, is kind of, seems more ethical for me at this point in time where I'm at.